So look, in every polity, you've had these hungry, needy, ambitious individuals, right? There's nothing new about it. In fact, it's been the normal form of government. And the extraordinary thing to me has been exactly as you say, to watch the way in which, the foreign policy hawks had no problem with Trump siding with Putin against the US intelligence agencies, the way the evangelicals and the kind of moral conservatives forgave all the lies and the fornications and the character flaws, the way that the Tea Party suddenly disappeared, had no problem with a $1 trillion deficit. The way all the kind of the character conservatives, right? The Straussian conservatives who said this is about restraint and civic virtue and courtesy, suddenly were making excuses. And so in a way, it's no surprise at all that we've ended up where we have now, which is that the law and order people are now attacking the process of law enforcement. Because all of, as you say, now, I mean, it's not to say that they haven't got a point about some of this. Political indictments happen, but this assumption that you get rid of the FBI and you get it is. If you had told me 10 years ago that it would be the Republican Party arguing this, I would have laughed.
Yeah. So, just more broadly speaking, how are you and your fellow countrymen? Are you all just watching this, scratching your heads? Do you worry about the constancy and reliability of the United States as an ally? Is that a conversation that is happening in the UK, or do you guys just chalk it up to the Americans are weird, but they eventually get to the right position, so don't worry about it?
So there's a very immediate way in which this is going to be tested, which is it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin's policy is to try and hold out for another 18 months in the hope of a Trump presidency, which would mean that he could more or less keep his gains or some of his gains in Ukraine. And so from that point of view, yes, it's a very immediate and live discussion. But honestly, Jonah, and I really hate having to say this, but all of my life until very recently, I regarded, as a lot of people here did, the US as basically an exporter of good things, of good values, freedom and democracy. And yeah, imperfect, we all make mistakes, but broadly, the definition of what a good country is, the grown up in the room. And what's happened in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, it goes beyond Trump. The big export from the US now, culturally, really because of the power of US media, is identity politics. And it's utterly captured the way in which the British discourse happens. So I, as God is my witness, if you go into a primary school in this country, Rosa Parks or Malcolm X will be more familiar names than John Locke or John Milton. If you're a white conservative, you're called a Klansman. If you're a black conservative, you're called an Uncle Tom. Never mind how rude all this is. What's it got to do with us, right? I mean, apart from anything, the big ethnic minority here is not black people; it's South Asian people, and yet, this absurd cosplaying reached its kind of hilarious height in the summer of 2020, when, in response to the George Floyd killing, we had the extraordinary sight of white British BLM protesters shouting, "Hands up, don't shoot," at unarmed London policemen. And on one level, it's kind of hilarious. On another level, we are importing a needless row. Selma and segregation was not our story. And yet, if you were a little black kid, if you were a little black British kid, just kind of catching the news on the edge of your peripheral vision, you would very naturally assume that white coppers in this country were going around murdering black people. And it's
right.
It's a very, very sad thing that I say this, but it's no longer, we used to US movies and US music and the power of US news used to be broadly a good thing, like a reminder that there was a good country out there compared to lots of the other ones. I'm not sure that's true right now.
Yeah, I mean, Macron, right? He had that big speech a couple of years ago about how wokeness is sort of a foreign mental disease or virus that is invading our country, and I have to say, I had much less sympathy for the French, given how many intellectual viruses they have infected the United States with over the last half century. It's like, oh, it doesn't feel good, does it? No, like now you know how we feel about Sartre. um,
Yeah.
but
Yes, exactly. A bit like apparently the conquistadors brought syphilis back from the New World, but kind of given what they had given the New World in terms of smallpox, mumps, measles, whatever. Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, but it is true that not speaking English is a partial defence against this
mhm,
madness. Uh, and if you're French, you have the extra defence of anything that comes out of the US, you're automatically against. So that kind of has helped them on this one.
right.
Um, I asked Jonathan Haidt about this when I was last in New York, because he's my guru and I sit at his feet whenever I pass through that city. And he said that he said, woke or fragility that he calls it, is largely an Anglosphere phenomenon, partly for the reason we've just given, that
Mhm.
it's linguistic, but partly, he said, because of the way in which universities are structured in English-speaking countries. So they're all basically modelled in the end on Oxford and Cambridge. They are elite and residential. And he said, if you go to a technical school, if you're living at home, if you've got a job while you're studying, or you're with your parents, you can't be infected because woke does not survive the amused reaction of your parents or your co-workers. So
Yeah.
you've got to be kind of ripped out of society and placed with a bunch of other people who think the way you do, so that you get into these purity spirals.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and Height's my guru and all sorts of things. I do think that there's a little bit more to it insofar as I think you can make an argument, and I've made the argument that wokeness in some ways is um, essentially a Veblen good, in the sense that being able to speak this nonsense is a way of signaling that your parents could afford to indoctrinate you in this nonsense. It used to be that you proved you were cultured if you could speak French. And that was a sign that you had the right tutors or went to the right schools or, had the
Yeah.
right
Or even more, that
connections.
you could speak Latin and Greek, because French had some theoretical application, whereas
Sure.
classics, which was the basis of private education in this country as late as when I started school, was purely a kind of conspicuous consumption. You have to study
Right.
to be a
Although
lawyer. Doctor. I can waste
I
my
was,
time doing it.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point. The only distinction I would make is that French in a lot of non-French countries, including Russia, was the language of the court, right?
Right.
And so for a lot of the left progressive meritocracy, speaking this language is, knowing the shibboleths is a way you screen people out who aren't members of your tribe. And so literally, I mean, putting your pronouns up on your Zoom screen is like wearing military insignia, delineating what army you're part of. And so I think that's part
100%.
of what has happened here.
Yeah, because the pronouns, in my experience anyway, are never surprising, right? You never think, "Oh, thank heaven you told me that," because otherwise I've never told so far. It is purely a way of, as you say, putting on the badge.
Um, so, uh, so American conservatism, you're not going to be surprised to learn, I think, is kind of a hot mess. And we can talk about the sort of the fondness for the new fondness for industrial policy, protectionism, all of these things, which I know must give you agita. But I was recently in the UK, and I was asking some folks how much of a hot mess the conservative movement there is, their conservative party. It's a little different, but and the basic answer I got was it's a mess, but within normal parameters. While in America, it's a mess outside of normal parameters. Is that about right? I mean, how are you guys doing over there?
Yeah, so I mean, there is no equivalent of Trump, and I know this always disappoints people who get their news from the New York Times, who loved to imagine that Boris Johnson was Trump. But Boris is, he's a very clever guy. He's a very self-aware guy, and he's a very polite man. I mean, it was really not. the coincidence of timing of Brexit and Trump did not actually mean that they were the same phenomenon. But look, I mean, I think conservatives the world over, and in the US as well as here, are suffering from kind of long lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
The lockdowns moved the dial on the relationship between state and citizen. We became habituated to the idea that we needed to ask permission to use our own property, to travel, and much more than that, and much worse than that. The perceived threat of the pandemic flicked switches in our brains, made us more collectivist, more authoritarian, more intolerant of any kind of outlier behavior or eccentricity. And rather like during the Second World War, I'm afraid that means that for years to come, the electorate will be much more demanding of the smack of firm government. The UK, if you like, kind of began to diverge a bit from the rest of the Anglosphere after 1940 because of the experience of conscription and mobilization being so much more intense and for longer. And the powers which the state had seized on a supposedly contingent basis in 1940 were not returned after 1945. On the contrary, the state kept getting bigger. And I'm afraid I can see the same thing here. So in a way, if you screen out the character of Trump and you look at the appeal of onshoring and big government and using the state to reward your friends and not having any truck with sort of taking welfare away from people and all that, that's actually become a surprisingly mainstream position among conservatives the world over. Did you think that kind of worried me, just to take this away from Trump, because I don't want people to think I'm obsessed with the guy. I was a very early lockdown critic, and from the start, and it was about the most unpopular thing I've ever done in politics or in commentary. So I was very in favor of Ron DeSantis because of what he achieved in Florida, because of the way he held out against all this resistance and against all this pressure, and was ultimately vindicated. But I have to say, I thought, what a comment on the state of conservatism that he thinks it's okay and everyone else thinks it's okay to tell private businesses that they are not allowed to require face masks. That a guy in a cafe or a small shop is told you may not require a vaccine mandate. Now, I thought vaccine mandates were nonsense, right? But am I imagining this, Jonah? Don't we remember a time when there would have been an assumption in favor of freedom and property and ownership rights, rather than both sides saying this is a culture war and we should marshal the full coercive power of the law to hurt the people we don't like?
Yeah, I mean, so I have a couple of questions, because first of all, almost every Brit I know or follow on the platform formerly known as Twitter, we're all anti-lockdown people, all appalled by all that kind of stuff. And so it's interesting to hear you say that conservatives in the UK were more statist than the impression that I got. And maybe I'm just getting a misread because of the selective bias of who I follow and from that world. But I'll tell you, I was much more of a middle of the road guy on all the COVID stuff. I was, I got to the point where listeners would start complaining that I said it too often, but I was like, I'm not anti-mask and I'm not pro-mask. I'm sort of anti-mask and I'm sort of the people who got too worked up about the stuff one way or the other, at least in the beginning, were the ones I had a problem with. So if in DC, I would see people driving alone in their cars with masks on. I would see people jogging in DC summer heat with masks on. I think that's friggin' crazy. I also think it's crazy to yell at somebody at a store for wearing a mask. If they want to wear it, that's freedom and liberty to me, right? That kind of thing. I was for the lockdown stuff about the first 2 weeks, and then my enthusiasm declined steadily thereafter. But I think that the problem that we have in the States right now is that I think you're right. DeSantis basically handled it better than almost anybody else. But the problem is you have to be, because of negative polarization. Negative polarization just means that you hate the other party more than you like your own, essentially. And so everything has to be taken to a point to where the other side feels aggrieved. Otherwise, you're not really leading. And that's sort of the essence of why all of these culture war fights, whether you're on one side or the other, everyone has to sort of twist the knife. Otherwise, their own side isn't celebrating, your speaking truth to power BS. And I don't know how you get out of that. I mean, federalism and subsidiarity are supposed to get us out of some of this stuff, because of the nature of polarization. I mean, you started before talking about how we're exporting our garbage culture war fights to you guys. So like this idea that you can be in a safe harbor outside of politics in the United States because you just happen to live in quote unquote flyover country, those days are kind of over. There is no
Right.
the whole cliche, all politics is local, no longer applies in the United States. That's profoundly unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's terrifying, actually. There was, do you know who I mean by Unamuno, the Basque philosopher, Miguel de Unamuno? There was, when you were talking, I was
I hate
reminded of
admitting I
something
don't
he
know
wrote.
any philosophers, but I don't know. I don't think I'm not up to speed on Basque
Spanish guy.
philosophers.
Some Spanish guy, but he wrote. There was a lovely line where he said, "Spain is divided between the anti-Xers who favor Z or Z, and the anti-Zers who favor X." Right, negative polarization. And 2 years later, those two factions were shooting at each other because they had run out of. They could no longer see each other as opponents. They saw each other as enemies, and you could trace the descent of that country into civil war. Civility and courtesy and moderation are virtues in politics because they make that unthinkable. And I mean, is it still unthinkable in the US? I would have said 10 years ago, completely unthinkable, right? But I mean, again, I'm speaking from the outside as a friend of the US and a friend of American democracy. So correct me if I'm getting this wrong. But is it now utterly inconceivable that you could have another highly contested election? That the result was, again, a close one. But that this time, the various Republican officials who honored their oath to the Constitution have been removed precisely for having done that. You could have rival sets of electors in some states. You could conceivably have two different presidents claiming a mandate and beginning to appoint their cabinets and leaving individual states to decide which one was legitimate. I'm not saying that is likely. I'm not even saying that it's a big possibility, but it is no longer unthinkable. And I think it was unthinkable 10 years ago. In fact, pretty much.
I agree. I mean, one of the things I'm most angry at Trump about is just simply he's ruined our ability to say we've had these 250 years of the peaceful transfer of power. Peaceful transfer of power is like one of these things in political science and political philosophy that is more important than a whole bunch of, mechanisms of how you decide elections and all that kind of stuff. That's this stuff better than I do, but the most important election in developing countries is the second one, right? Is the one where the guy who was in power the first time leaves power, because that's and to muck around with that is terrible. And we had a piece at the Dispatch recently. I'm blanking on the author, but it was very good. Noting that if you look at the timeline closely and seriously about what John Eastman and some of these guys and Jeffrey Clark and some of these guys were arguing for, they were saying, "Oh, we got to get these fake electors, so that we can send it to the House and blah blah blah." And someone says, "Look, there's going to be riots in the streets." And Eastman says, "Well, that's either Eastman or Clark says that's why we have the Insurrection Act." So, in other words, if you take these guys seriously, what they were saying is the scheme that we're pushing to steal an election is going to lead to violence, and then we're going to order either the National Guard or the U.S. military to use violence to put down these people who are actually right to be angry. That's, again, I don't think we're heading towards a civil war anytime soon, but the idea that is that is something that in the highest levels of a White House and a Justice Department, you have people who are seriously committing to a chain of events that would give them permission to ignite popular violent protests and then use the military to put it down. That gets us to pretty close to the sort of these worst case scenario things that you're conjuring.
Correct. I mean, it was Karl Popper who said this, wasn't it, in The Open Society and its Enemies? He said, look, forget democracy being a kind of theoretically brilliant system, because it actually isn't. You've got once you really overthink, could a majority of 50% plus one establish an autocracy or whatever, you have all sorts of conceptual problems with democracy. He said, think of it instead as something that it was not intended to do, but actually is really good at doing. It's a way of getting people out of power without bloodshed. And if you see the
Right.
good of democracy as being enabling you to turn the rascals out, then lots of other good things happen. For example, it lowers the price of participation. It means that good people, successful, respectable citizens will stand for election because the price for failure is not exile or being shot, because you have a mechanism for
Right.
peaceful power. It also means that you habituate the electorate to the idea of civil and civilized disagreement, that you have the loyal opposition, that they're not against the country, that they're still doing their best. And it acts as a constraint on those in power, because they think whatever I do today is going to be in the hands of that guy tomorrow, so I will exercise self-control when it comes to aggrandizing the state. Now, if you see democracy in those terms, then I think, again, it's not even Trump. It's the indifference of Americans who should know better to process when they happen to favor a particular outcome. This is the really, really dangerous thing. And it leaves me wondering, I'm going to plug your book because this is the one audience that will be familiar with it. But your fantastic book about the suicide of the West, lurid title, but great thesis, that all of this is kind of fragile and artificial, and that actually we are quite tribal creatures, that the most natural thing for us is to want the guy who is the head of our tribe, that the weird thing is that people ever gave their loyalty to some desiccated piece of parchment on the wall of the National Archives or to some imaginary ideal. In a way, right, the odd thing is not that we're having Trump now, it's we had the previous 200 years. What a miracle that was. But given that it was such a miracle, given that we can see how much happier and wealthier and freer people became, how much more fulfilled they became, how much longer their lives were, and all the rest of it, isn't it worth fighting for?
Isn't it worth being just a little grateful for, right? Just a little sort of, hey, this worked out pretty well, thank you, is a sentiment that is so lacking these days. I agree with you entirely. And Karl Popper, I know. I'm not Basque philosophers. I'm behind the eight ball on, but I agree. I sometimes think, and maybe I should write about this, is that I think that one of the things that, how Tom Sowell has the whole conflict of visions, unconstrained versus constrained vision, which I think is a useful way to think about these things. But I think another way to think about it is that the conservative, rightly understood, or temperamental conservative, however we want to put it, sees most of our valuable and cherished institutions and practices not as a path to supreme happiness or perfection or utopianism or anything like that, but as a hedge against disaster, right? And so education, for instance, my people, the reason why Jewish mothers want their kids to be doctors and lawyers isn't because it's going to make them rich. It's because it's going to guarantee they won't be poor. I am not for democracy because I think in some John Dewey or Herbert Crowley kind of sense that it is going to activate our purest Rousseauian selves and we'll live in a perfect state of bliss and harmony with our society. It's that democracy is a hedge against all of the terrible things that happen when you don't have leaders held accountable, and when you don't have a society that feels like it has buy-in to how decisions are made. And so democracy leads to lots of bad outcomes, but it is a really great insurance policy against much, much worse ones. And I think this is sort of the divide between, first of all, people who know history and people who don't, but also between a certain kind of conservative outlook that wants a good society but knows you can't have a perfect society, and a certain kind of progressive or Rousseauian outlook that thinks, oh, if we could just jigger the dials exactly the right way on society, everyone will be happy in every regard and all the unity of goodness will proceed to the sunny uplands of history.